Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today I'm going to share 20 hacks for getting the most out of your watercolor pencils. I'll be using a set of 36 pencils from our sponsor AmazeRock. These pencils are a great buy and come in a beautiful fabric roll-up. I received these pencils months ago and they have been so handy to keep in my travel art bag and take on the go. AmazeRock is giving away a free AmazeRock watercolor pencil set to 3 lucky viewers. Please click the link in the video description to enter the contest. I'll also have a link if you'd like to purchase a set. The nice thing about watercolor pencils is that they layer easily and dissolve in water, so these 36 pencils will make thousands of different colors. It's really great for art on the go because all you need is one roll of pencils, some paper, and a water brush. It's great for summertime travel. The first tip or hack I have for you today for watercolor pencils is taping down your paper to a board or a piece of cardboard or a piece of foam core. Anything you have handy. You can even use the back of an old watercolor paper pad. That would work really well. The benefit to having your paper taped down is twofold. For one, it's going to keep it from wrinkling and buckling as you're working, especially if you're doing some of the wet into wet techniques I'm going to show you. And the other really neat thing is that you'll have a really pretty white border when you remove your tape later. I just use inexpensive tape from the dollar store, and if you're worried that your masking tape is too sticky, because you can spend a lot of money and buy the really low tack painter's tape, if you're worried that your paint is too sticky, stick it to your clothing first. It will pick up some lint and make it less sticky. Another tip is just to heat this with a hairdryer before you remove your tape, and it will make it easier to remove. Now, talking about a painting board, this is a piece of masonite which you can go to a hardware store and have it cut for you. Like any of your big box home improvement stores will have this, but even better, this was actually a paneling sample and it was discontinued and it was free, so it's a perfect surface and it didn't cost me a dime. Speaking of paper, depending on what you are going to paint, you'll want a different paper surface. I'm using hot press watercolor paper today, so it's really smooth, almost like a drawing paper, so it's going to be really great for drawing the details like whiskers and fur on my cat, but it's watercolor paper, so it's going to take all the water I can dish out. So I'm going to show you here. Now this is Arches. It's one of my favorite brands. This is the smooth paper that we're working on today. If I tip it to the light, you can see that it's got a very smooth surface. I also recommend that you don't touch your paper, especially if you use hand cream, because it can leave a grease spot on your paper and then the paint won't stick to it. Now this texture is called rough. This is the roughest paper. This is like if you were doing landscapes and you were painting sand and rocks and you wanted that texture. This would be an ideal surface for you. I'm not sure if you can see it on the light, but there's lots of hills and valleys on this paper. So when you color over it with your watercolor pencils, you're going to get a much rougher surface. And I'll just show you on a little section here on the edge just so you can see what I mean. So if I go over to the edge here and I do a little coloring with a colored pencil, watercolor pencil, look at that. Look at all that rough texture. So you can think about how easy it would be to paint sand and rocks and waves using a paper like this versus a hot press paper, where if I color on the edge there, you'll see there's hardly any sparkle or any grain showing. I get a very smooth laydown, and that's with very little pressure. Now, somewhere in the middle is probably your all-purpose paper that you'll use for a lot of things, and that is cold press. That's usually what you can find in any art supply store and craft store. They generally have this. The surface is somewhere in between a rough and a hot press. It's not quite as bumpy as the rough. You see those side by side? But it's also not quite as smooth as the hot press. Okay, so when you're thinking about what you're going to paint, think about what sort of texture you want. Do you want your watercolor pencils to give you rough texture if you're to go over them like that? Do you want a surface that's kind of in the middle? Or do you want something that's smooth, that's going to let you get a lot of detail, like what we're going to do with our cat today? So that's why I chose hot press paper. You can buy those in big sheets too and tear them down to the size that you want to save a little money. When we're working with watercolor pencils, we want to make sure that we eliminate as many mistakes as we can. So it's really important when you're drawing something that is really detailed that you make an accurate sketch. And I recommend you sketch on a piece of scrap paper first, and then you can either use a light box or graphite paper to transfer it onto your good watercolor paper. And the reason for this is that if you have to do any erasing, you could mar the surface of your expensive watercolor paper, and then when you go to add water to your watercolor pencils, you're going to have a patchy wash. Places that that have a lot of erasing are going to take the paint a lot heavier, and places that don't have a lot of erasing are going to take the paint lighter. So it's best not to erase on your surface if you can avoid it. The next tip I have to share has to do with sharpening. So there's a couple different ways to sharpen your pencils. I usually use an electric sharpener, but handhelds will work well. The thing to remember is that you want to hold your pencil still and you want to turn the sharpener. This can be very awkward because it's kind of opposite from what we've all been taught, but the reason you do this is because the lead inside the pencil is a little bit more fragile than the lead that would be in like a regular drawing pencil. So you want to minimize the chance that that pencil lead is going to wiggle around and snap. So that way you can get a nice sharp point for when you want to do details like fur and whatnot on your picture. But let's say you want to do a big wash, so you really want to conserve your lead. So if you look here, you're going to see that not only are you taking off wood, but you're taking off some of the lead as well. So if you want to conserve that lead, I recommend you use a X-Acto knife or some other craft knife, and that way you can kind of just whittle off the wood and end up with a nice long lead that you can pick up for washes, or you can grate onto your surface for texture, and we'll do that technique in a minute. But this way you can save a lot of your lead. But it's not as good if you want a fine point for details. The next technique I'm going to show you is a wet into wet wash. I like to start off my pictures with washes because I feel like it unifies the piece and it really saves a lot of the work down the road. So I'm going to do a background wash, and I'm simply wetting my paper with clean water and a angled brush. You could use a flat brush for this. I recommend using brushes that have golden taklon bristles versus natural hair bristles, or even the bristles that are meant to act like squirrel or Kolinsky sable, just because when you're using watercolor pencils, you're going from this harder cake of color on the lead, and it has a little bit more body than your regular watercolor paint, so you just need a little extra stiffness in your brush to get it to behave. I want the background to be very soft, and I found this really light blue pencil that I had kind of whittled off the lead for so I could get a lot of color. Now another thing I recommend is having a test piece of like scrap of watercolor paper. This can be the leftover or a back of a painting that you didn't really like. Don't throw that paper away, save it for your tests so you can just do some little tests on the back. That way you can see if you like a color before you commit it to your painting. So there's a couple ways that you can do a wash that I recommend. One is to just use your brush and pick up the color from the tip of the pencil and spread it around. This works really well because you don't need to have any extra equipment. Now I chose this pale color because I wanted to have a really soft background with maybe a little bit of texture in it. Now another way you can do this is to make your own palette. So what I did here was I took this, this is actually from a inexpensive art set. I took this palette and I sanded it with some sandpaper, just your regular old sandpaper that you have in your workshop. Now on the back it's not sanded. Well, my paper's, let me just use a pencil, a darker one you can see. So on the side that's not sanded, you can still use it. It will still grab some color. But if I scribble this on the sanded side, you're going to see that I can get way more color to lay down, and then all I need to do is use a wet brush to pick it up. So I'm just going to go ahead and make, oops, because I sharpened that so much, I actually weakened the lead because it was wet. So I wouldn't probably recommend scribbling your wet pencil down there, because when your pencil is wet, it is more fragile. So there's another tip for you. Wet lead is fragile, dry lead is more robust. So let me just take this gray here, and I'll add some of that to my palette because I do want to darken that blue a little bit, and maybe I'll even add in a little bit of a darker blue over here. And that way I can kind of mix my colors. And that lead is perfectly good to use. All you have to do is dissolve it a little bit with some water. And that's where the stiffer brush comes in handy, because it really will help liquefy that. I can add a little bit of that gray in there so that it's not so vivid, because I really want the cat to stand out, so I don't want my background to steal the show. And because the background is wet, it's going to blend. I'm not going to get any weird hard lines, and it's going to make it really a lot easier to paint here. I like the backgrounds to be kind of soft and blendy because it just gives you a nice atmosphere, and it makes your cat or whatever you're painting not look like it's cut and pasted. And so this way you get all the benefits of watercolors right from your watercolor pencil. So it's one less thing you have to buy, or one less thing you have to, you know, carry with you if you're looking to go paint on location. Now there's a couple different ways to get texture. Say you want to have a little more texture in your background, so you know you want to have a little bit something, you know, it just looks a little too plain to you. I think this background looks pretty, just plain, but if you want more texture, there's a few things that you might want to do. One is just to spritz on some water, and you can just do that from a spray bottle, and you'll get a very subtle texture that way. Another texture that's kind of fun is to grate your colored pencil. Now again, do this with a dry one, because if you do it with a wet one, you're going to snap the lead off like I just did when I tried to scribble it on my palette. So I've got this gray pencil here. I'm just going to grate it. You can see this is all colorful because I use it for grating different things if I want that texture effect. And I'm just gently going to drag it across. And all these little specks of pencil can drop off into my wash. Now if the paper is not super duper wet, the speckles might not do anything. And I want these kind of low so they can kind of weight the bottom of the picture a little bit. So what I can do is either apply water with a spray bottle or apply water with a brush. If I get this on and decide, oh, it's a little too much texture, kind of looks like there's fleas jumping off my cat, and that's not what I was going for, I can go in and soften it a little bit with a brush. And I can keep working it until I get just the level of texture that I want. So maybe like if you were out and you were painting on a beach and you wanted that texture of the speckles of sand, or you're painting a road, or you're doing something where you just need a little bit of that texture, this is an excellent way to go about and get it. Another fun thing to do for texture, and this isn't going to look really dramatic on this wash because it's so light, but to use salt. You can use table salt, kosher salt, it does not matter. Sea salt, really, it doesn't matter. I usually just grab my salt shaker in the kitchen. But you can just sprinkle this on your wash and you will get a very fine kind of snowflakey texture. And of course, it will be more dramatic the wetter your paper is. And I have a little bit of that. I did a little bit here, but it's not really dry yet. You just get kind of like these little bursts of lighter on the darker wash. So the darker your color, the more strong that's going to look. So let's use that background texture technique, or the background wash technique, to get some colors on the body of our cat. Now, one thing I'm going to warn you is that you do not want to go right next to an area that you have just painted if you don't want it to blend. So with watercolor and watercolor pencils, if you're working in a wash, the paint is only going to go where the paper's wet. Okay, so if your paper's dry, your paint's going to stay where it is. If you just want a certain area to have some color, then just wet that certain area and your paint will stay there. So I'm just going to wet this area here, and I'm going to grab my kind of yellowy ochre color pencil, number 85. And I'm going to just pick it right up off of the stick, because I'm not going after a ton of color here, so that's fine. If I needed to like paint the whole cat this color, then I probably would scribble it out on my palette dry. Remember, you scribble it dry or you could break your lead. But the lead is still usable, so just save it on your palette and it'll be good for next time. Use a bigger brush than you think you're going to need for two reasons. For one, you're going to cover more ground, and it's going to make you less fussy if you start in with that big brush. Save your tiny brushes and your details for when you're further on in your picture. Anytime I see that color, anywhere I see that nice warm yellowy brown, I'm just going to go ahead and add that in really lightly. With watercolors, we typically work light to dark. So we want to get those light layers on first, and then we'll layer over our darker colors as we go. If you want a soft edge, you can flick some of the color out to the outside so it kind of butts up into the wash, and it will kind of fade into the background, and that's a really nice effect. The only thing you want to be worried about, or just be aware of, is not to be adding too much water, because if you go in with a lot of water here where the paper's a little bit damp, you could end up with what's called blooms or cauliflowers, which are these really kind of roughly shaped edges that sometimes look really cool like in backgrounds, but other times can look really really distracting and unfortunate. So, you know, just know how to handle it so you can force that effect when you want it, but you don't get it when you don't want it. I want to look at that gray that we had used that we graded in the background, because I think that would be a really nice color for some of the fur. I'm going to see if this is dry enough. Yeah, we never wet this one, so I can go ahead and I can make myself a nice little palette, a nice little pan of that in my palette. You can see the scratches from the sandpaper, how it makes like ridges that grab the tooth, grab the pencil really well. I think it's really handy. And you could probably make a small one that would fit in your roll up here so that you could roll it right up in there. There's plenty of room in those roll ups. So maybe take like if you took like a milk carton, like not a milk carton, but a plastic milk container, I think you could really, you could make yourself a little palette that would even roll right up in your set. So that would be a nice thing to do, I think. And that way you could still have that option and still only have one thing to carry. Now we've got some shadow under the muzzle, so I might as well do that with this color. So far we've used this all just like watercolor paint. I love the immediacy of just grabbing my pencil and just picking up the color. Now I'm kind of dry brushing a little bit, which is a technique where your brush isn't super wet, so you can see that the bristles kind of want to pull apart there. And because they're pulling apart, it's like I have all those little hairs that are going to paint little hairs. And even though I'm not in the detail portion yet, it's going to reinforce that, and I'm making layers of hairs on the kitty cat. Just make sure when you're painting, it's like you're brushing the kitty cat, like you're patting the kitty cat. I don't know why I'm saying kitty cat. But if you do it that way, then every layer that you put on is going to reinforce that, and it's going to reinforce that direction, and it's going to give that cat that silky fur that that she has. So it's just kind of a nice technique to get in the habit of using. I wouldn't want to go this way. If you went that way, you're going to disrupt that effect. So always paint going with the contour of your item or with the fur direction of your animal. And that's where our line drawing comes in handy, because we can see those lines. And also if I dry brush right next to the edge, there's not going to be enough water on my brush for it to create cauliflowers or blossoms on me. Now as I get into the face, this brush is probably a little bit too big to be trying to get in here with, but I still am going to try to get as much as I can done with this brush before switching over. Also turning your brush sometimes so you don't end up with harsh, blunt areas where you start and stop can be really handy. When you're dry brushing, your paper is going to dry quickly, so that's really handy so that you can keep layering over without having to stop. Now before I sharpen this pencil, because look, we're down to almost the wood, I need to let this dry. If I don't, I'm probably going to damage the lead and waste a lot of pencil. So keep that in mind. If you got wet pencils, take a break and come back after they dry. Now that the paper is dry, you can see the texture that the salt made in the background. It's subtle and pretty because we had a light background color. Now sometimes you're going to want to draw directly with your pencils. So I thought it would be nice to go and get some of the shading in on our cat here. So I'm just going to go and I'm just going to make sure when I put my shading in that again I am coloring with the direction of the fur, but I'm also going really lightly because I don't want to dent the paper. If I dent the paper, when I go over to add water, I might not be able to get those marks away, and it might be more difficult to dissolve my pencil. So I want to make sure that I'm not going to have any trouble dissolving this paper. And because we're on a smooth paper, I shouldn't have really harsh lines to dissolve. Everything should go down fairly smoothly. If I wasn't doing fur and I was coloring something that had more of a smooth texture to it, like say the skin of an apple or a grape or something like that that was uniform in color, I would do little ovals, like overlapping ovals to color to make sure that it wasn't going to leave any texture behind, like kind of like that. But because I have fur here and I know the direction it's going in, I am going to go ahead and drag it out in that direction. Now this pencil I have sharpened with a knife because I've been using so much of this color that I don't want to waste any of the lead. I know I'm going to need it. So I am actually using the blunt end to add this color down, which is just fine because I'm going to be doing details later with a very sharp pencil, or maybe even scraping some in with the edge of an old credit card. So I'll show you that technique when we get to it. The lines I'm using here, even though they're going to be dissolved, and we'll talk about them more later, are called hatching, and I'm using a back and forth motion. I'm just going with the shape of the fur and the shadows on the cat and just trying to get those values in. Now keep in mind, when I add water to this, everything's going to get darker, so I don't want to go as dark as I think I need to. It can be a little deceiving, but we want to make sure that we don't end up with more color than we're bargained for, because like I mentioned before, it's a lot harder to make something lighter than it is to make it darker in watercolor or watercolor pencils. Now when you go in the face, it's the same exact technique, just make sure that you are accurately putting in your color. That's why I put some markings on the sketch so that I could see where I was going to want those darker lines, and I didn't have to guess or kind of make it up as I went along. Inside the ears, I am using a little bit of an overlapping oval stroke just to tone the tops of the ears where it's a little bit darker. So remember, just match your coloring to the surface and the texture you're trying to achieve. Now it's time to add some water. You can use all sorts of different brushes for this. This brush has flagged bristles. If I get it wet, you can really see what I mean. And they split apart when they are wet. And this is called a rake brush because it looks kind of like a rake. And if I use this to dissolve my color, I'm going to get a little bit more texture than I would if I used anything else. So it's just another way that you can layer on your fur textures without a lot of work. And I can also kind of drag it on so that I can get a little bit of texture elsewhere. And I just want to make sure that when I'm raking it here, when I'm using the rake brush, that I'm going with the texture of the fur, just as if I was petting the fur. I wouldn't want to pet against the grain. I don't want to brush against the grain either. So you want to do that and liquefy all of the pencil that we just put down. For a more dramatic look, when you are doing the fur, is a technique called scraping. And what I'm going to do is take this dark brown pencil and take some of that gray that we were using and put them together on my dry palette here. Now the dry palette is going to work better than a wet palette, so when you are doing this and you're using the palette for a bunch of different colors, make sure it's dry where you're using it so that you don't end up with because it can weaken the lead if you get your lead wet when you're trying to wet it, and it can also just not take as much lead. Okay, so I'm going to mix this out. I have a couple shades of gray and I've got that brown there. And then I want to go in some areas where I have quite a bit of dark, especially down here on the bottom. I want this to be kind of a little bit darker here underneath this kind of yellower area. Again, I'm painting this on just like I would with watercolor, but I'm going with the grain. Now this is one of my favorite techniques. I use a lot when I'm watercolor painting, but it works really well when we're using our watercolor pencils wet. And this is taking an old credit card or gift card and scraping the texture into your paper. Now the only thing that you want to just keep in mind as you're doing this is that whatever you scrape, this is permanent. This texture is going to be in your paper permanently. So if I go over this again, any of those scrapes that I put in the paper are going to get darker. They're going to pull more pigment because I've damaged the paper. It's going to suck into those lines. Just like when I said don't erase too much on your paper, because you really don't want to erase on your paper because you could damage it and then it's going to take the paint unevenly. It's going to take the paint stronger in areas where you've erased. It's the same thing with the scraping, except we are just doing kind of little scratches, and that's where the paint's going to gonna grab. But it's the same exact principle. But we're doing it on purpose, I should say. Grab that rake and pull some of those little furs down. But I really like this technique for tone-on-tone furs. I feel like if I just do it here and there, I don't have to put a ton of detail in, and I get the point across, and it looks like there's a lot of detail. And I also have noticed that on hot press paper, it does tend to
it can tend to be a little more dramatic than on cold pressed paper, and it almost feels like it wants to pill your paper a little bit more on a hot press paper. So just keep that in mind, that your results will be a little bit stronger on the hot press. I really like to do the watercolor techniques because I paint in watercolor more than watercolor pencil, and I like being able to cover a little bit more ground by using the watercolor techniques like this. You can do this as much or as little as you want, and if you don't like it, you don't have to do it at all. But it's just another thing to know, so that when you are looking for texture, if you feel like you're just not getting that expression that you want down, or if you're just short on time and you know, maybe you're painting your cat and your cat doesn't want to sit still very long, you can use those techniques to speed things along. So I'm going to keep going through and adding more darks where I need them. This brush is a filbert brush. It's kind of like a flat, but it's rounded on the end, so I can kind of twirl it around and get the same, all the benefits of a flat and a round with the same brush. So I like to use that. And also it is more of like the type of bristle that you would have for acrylic, so it does push around the pigment a little bit better than a soft watercolor brush is. So I look at a soft watercolor brush, you have these really soft fluffy bristles, and they're just not pushy enough to move some of that pigment around sometimes. So that's why I like to go with that when I am doing my watercolor pencil. But don't be afraid of getting some of those shadows in there, because you are going to need the shadows and the contrast for everything to look natural. I'm going to grab some gray and add some gray to the muzzle. This is a super light gray. It would be very similar to like a Davies gray in watercolor. It is number 112 in the Amaze Rock pencil line. I am going to add that to the muzzle because it's looking way too light. I'm also going to add it to other light areas, like the white. Well, it looks like white. It's not really white though. It's super light for elsewhere on the face. I know these subtle layers can seem like they take a long time, but you know what? Painting is fun. Take your time and enjoy it. Okay? Often I don't use black watercolor pencils or black watercolor, but sometimes you just need a little extra push of color that doesn't want to mix out of other colors that you have. I generally do a blue and a brown, but that was still giving me more of a lighter color than I wanted, so I thought I would go in and just directly color in these super darks, like around the eyes. So I'm just taking a nice sharp black pencil. This is number 120, and I'm going in and I'm going to add my darkest darks. Now keep in mind that if I am to touch a wet brush next to this, it's going to want to liquefy it. So I will want to go in, get my darks, and then go in with a fine brush and liquefy them a little bit so they're not going to be so reactive if I go in with a dark color later. I don't want to do the irises yet, because the pupils yet, because if I do, then I think I'll end up kind of locked down when I go to the eyes, and I'll have to work around it, and I don't want to do that. I would rather put the irises on top after when I'm all done, but I do want to get that dark in there because I feel like I need to represent my darkest value so that the rest of the picture can come together. I'm also going to do a little bit here in the nose because I want the face to be the focal point. So by getting this done in now, I think that's going to really help me achieve that. So for a brush for this, I'm actually, because I find that flat brushes work a little bit better if I am not using a lot of water and I'm going to dilute the, or lock down that pigment. So I'm using a small flat brush. When I wet it, I want to have a paper towel handy, and I want to make sure there are no beads of water on the ferrule or the metal part of the brush, because if that slides down while I'm trying to work here in this tight area, it is going to make a mess. It's going to give me this really uncontrolled black splat, and it could really ruin a painting. So by liquefying this now, it's going to eliminate me getting into that by accident later and messing things up. I can also kind of feather some of this color out a little bit so I get kind of a natural little natural shading around there. And that will eliminate how close I have to come to the eye with my surrounding colors. So I'm going to wet my brush. I'm just going to make sure that I get the water off the ferrule. I'm going to go back in and I am going to come around this eye and do the same thing. If you are, painting at home and you find this very awkward, like this is a little awkward for me to be reaching in here at this angle, turn your whole painting board around. That's another great thing about taping your paper onto a painting board, is that you can move everything around. You can twist it and turn it and make it so it's comfortable when you're working. You don't want to, have a painting session and then you stand up from your painting session and just be achy and stiff all day. Take care of yourself. Make sure you're comfortable when you're working, and your paintings will come out better too, because they won't have any awkwardness. They won't look awkward. Like sometimes you see that, a line is just rough or awkward because the person couldn't reach in there and, pull that brush stroke as easily as they would have been if it was better aligned. Now where I'm looking at the nose, and I actually put a couple colors on my palette that I thought would be nice to mix for the nose. So I've got a yellow, I've got a little bit of red and a little bit of pink, because no color on its own was exactly right, and with watercolor pencils you can mix them to get thousands of different colors. So I decided I would mix up a nice little color for the nose. I wanted kind of like a salmon color, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to dab it in first. Just kind of stipple it in there. I think I really like that color. Now the reference photo has the cat with like a half of the nose is white and half is that orangey pink color, but I think I'm actually going to make it all that orangey pink color. And then sometimes you'll see this color, like the same color elsewhere. I think I want to take a little bit of that color and add it into the ears. So even though I don't see it in my reference photo, I know my cat has a little bit of a tint of pink in their ears. And the more that you paint, the more observant you get. So then you can kind of go take your artistic license and add, your knowledge of the world to your painting. So I'm just doing a very, very pale tint. Then it also gives that same color somewhere else to be, so it doesn't look out of place. I find that sometimes when you have a lot of colors, 36 is a lot of colors, and if you're using a lot of them rather than mixing, and you can almost kind of tell an amateur versus a professional painting by how many colors they used, because you'll see colors it's like, where'd that color come from? It just looks too hodgepodge. By mixing your own colors and adding it in different spots of your painting, you end up with a much more natural looking picture. I can even take some of this and just kind of dry brush it around in the fur, and even though it's not anything you'd really notice, it's subconsciously just kind of cross-pollinating all those colors. I could add it to some of the yellow ochre that I was using and just add some layers of it. It's just a soft color that I think will enhance lots of areas of the cat and make it feel more alive. Sometimes you want some really bright detail on an area like this fur in the ears. So a great way to do this with watercolor pencils is the wet on dry technique. So the ears are wet. I've got a nice sharp pencil here, and what I'm going to do is just simply draw with a sharp pencil right into the wet paint on the ears, and it is going to give me the crispest lines. Now the thing you want to keep in mind for this is that those lines are not going to be easily dissolved. So you want to make sure that you absolutely want those lines to remain. It's also nice to layer a few different colors. So if you have a few different shades of brown or gray or maybe like an ochre color that you can add in together, they will make a really nice effect when you do that. Now you also want to make sure you're going to do this in a few places, because if you just do it in one place it can look really weird and awkward. So what I'm going to do is just add a little bit of kind of wetness in here, some light kind of brown color, and I'm going to get some little ochre colored furs in here. Now just remember, if your pencil dulls down, the pencil that you need to use, don't sharpen it wet, because you could break the tip and then waste quite a bit of lead. So just do what you need to do. If it goes dull on you, just kind of fade out some of the edges. And you're just really giving it a little bit of a hint of color. You can see even if I brush over that, those colors are still going to stay crisp. Those lines are going to stay crisp because, again, just like scraping with a credit card scraper, you're marring the paper and you're giving it like a little scratch, and that scratch is going to grab whatever pigment you put in there. And don't worry if you have white hairs that you want to be able to get in there, because I have a trick for getting those white highlights in at the end, which I will share when we're ready to do that section. I feel like I want to cool off this part of the ear a little bit, so I'm going in with a little bit of a blued gray. And you can overlay other colors, and then those scratches will grab and take the, be influenced by the color that you add on top. Now I feel like I really need to go in with some deeper colors. So on my palette, I have actually, when I was sharpening some of my colors, I broke the lead because I had a sharpener that wasn't really that sharp. So I just grabbed the leads and stuck them on my palette and sprayed them with some water, and then voila, I had an instant watercolor palette. So keep that in mind. Don't waste it. It's not just because your pencil lead breaks. Maybe you dropped your pencils on the floor, that happens, or maybe your kids used them and they dropped them on the floor, and you go to sharpen it and they break. Don't throw those leads away. Just drop them in a palette, spray them with water, and they'll turn into a pan of watercolor, and that is so useful. It's almost just as useful as having these as pencils. I mean, I personally am more of a watercolorist than a pencil artist, so I feel much more comfortable kind of dipping my brush into some paint and going that way. I like to do this especially for my darker areas because I feel very like, if I don't have those darks in there, I'm very timid about going in there and adding details and stuff. So if I can give myself the permission and excuse to get my darks in, I'm gonna have a much easier time of the whole painting process. Again, I'm using that filbert. So I'll use it on the chisel edge if I want a lighter, skinnier line, and then I'll use it on the broad edge if I want a thicker line. And I love that all those credit card scrapes and all the pencil lines I did direct dry onto wet are staying there so that they just get deeper and more interesting and more rich the more I do it. Now if I grab that rake, I can add some tiny little furs around the nose, because the hair goes a little bit, like it'll kind of follow the contours of the face, so it's not just going straight up and down like it is on other parts of the cat. So I can kind of just put in these little cross hatching marks kind of around the nose to give that nose a little bit more shape. Hatching, cross-hatching, scumbling, these are all techniques that we use to create texture with pencil, and because we're working with watercolor pencil, we can use the best of all techniques. We can use all of our painting and all of our drawing techniques together. So I don't want to do this over the whole body. I just want to go in here with this rake brush any place I feel like I want a little bit of that fur texture to be a little more pronounced. I want the face to be the focal point, so I can go over those areas where I put the stronger shadows, the thicker lines, and then I can just kind of feather off the edges with the rake brush. Another thing this is really nice for is when you get to the edge of your animal and you're coming up next to the background, you can flick out the colors here and have that little bit of fuzz showing up like on the outside of the cat, almost as like a frame kind of. It's just, you just see these little tufts of fluff, and that really helps it look like a fuzzy cat and not like a paper cutout, because sometimes that's the look that you get. Everything wants to kind of just look too crisp, so you need a little bit of that, just a little hint of fluff here and there. You don't want him to look mangy. You just want it to have like a little bit of fuzz, a little bit of floof. Like sometimes we'll go in with one brush, I'll put in a stronger amount of color. Just kind of dab it, just like put like a bead of color where I want it the darkest. like let's say under this ear right here. I want that nice and dark. And then I'll go with the rake and I'll just fluff it out. And then it gives it a natural place for it to start from, and then it fades off into a very natural looking shadow. I can do some of this. I don't really have a really dark area over here, but I do feel like I need some of the hairs in the ears to be a little bit darker. And then where it grabs any of the lines that I sketched in earlier with the dry on wet technique, it will just add a little bit of extra extra hair and texture. And I'm just gonna drag some of that a little bit lower so it doesn't look like it kind of comes out of nowhere. Do the same over here. I want some darker, and then I'm just gonna drag it up. And over here. So it's really handy to have a few different brushes that you can draw upon. This is fairly dark coming in and around to the nose. I know if I can get kind of a juicy bead of paint, then I can just go in with a rake and soften it. And it's those layers upon layers that give animals that texture when you're trying to paint them. And you got to kind of do it one spot at a time to keep it wet enough so that you can blend it out. Now if you get too dark, like I almost feel like that side is a little too dark and he's looking a little raccoony, you can go in, scrub with a little bit of water, and grab a paper towel and blot it off. Because everybody makes mistakes, that was a little too dark, and then I was able to correct it. Any place that feels a little too dark, I can go right in and do that same thing. Like I feel like the tip of the nose is a little too dark where the fur is, so I'm going to lighten that up. It's a little dark right there. So again, I can lighten it up. Now anywhere that I have scraped, those I'm still going to see that texture, okay? So don't worry about losing your hard work. If you did some scraping, it will remain. But this is kind of a subtractive painting technique, and it's really nice to be able to do this. I find that watercolor pencils lift a little bit better than watercolor paint, so it's kind of nice. It's like you have a little undo button with this media. I still feel like the body of the cat needs a little bit more of a little bit more contrast, a little bit more color, so I'm going to go ahead and use my palette here and those broken leads that I have in there, those 2 shades of brown. I'm going to put this yellow ochre in here, and I'm going to build up the color because I want to make sure that the body has enough color to it. I'm going to start with my lightest color, which is this ochre color, and I'm just going to go back and add a few little little swaths of it where I feel like it needs it. See a little bit of that over here. When you're working in slow transparent layers, you never go too wrong. So you're doing such small adjustments each time that it's really easy to correct a mistake because you're never going to get too far wrong. I'm going to the next shade of brown, and I'm going to add some of that in, and where it goes over the scraping, it's just going to make those details a little bit deeper, and that's fine. And one little shade up there. And I do need a little shade under the chin, but I don't want it super dark. I want a little bit of shadow, but it's definitely not as dark as some of the fur down here. I try to find lines where I can carry different elements of the body together. So I've got these, this stripe over by the eye, and that stripe does seem to want to follow the fur down into the mane. So I want to find different areas where I can connect this all as one piece, because I felt like the head was feeling a little bit disconnected. I just want to get all that beautiful volume of fur. So you want the texture and the volume. So you kind of have to balance those two things so it doesn't just look like a huge pom-pom fluff ball. I'm going to take a break from the fur and work on the eyes for a bit, and I'm going to start with a really pale green. I'm going to go over the pupil, but I'm not going over the highlight on the eye because I want that to stay white, and I like to keep the white of the paper if I can. I do have tricks for getting the whites back if we need to, but I always aim to keep the white of the paper. Oh, and as I use a pencil, I bring it over to this side, and I try to remember to keep all the pencils that I'm currently using on my right side and all the colors I haven't used yet on my left side, just so that I can always grab from a color that I've used first. I'm going to grab some of this kind of ochre color to add into the eyes because I really see that color in there. And I want to get all those beautiful flecks of color in the eye. And I'm going to grab a little bit of this blue to add into the center part of the iris because it is a little bit more greeny blue, and I want to use the colors I've already used as much as possible so that I have that harmony that we talked about before. Okay, now I am going to use a small brush to liquefy that, and I think I'm actually going to use that same small brush that we used around the eye, so that way I don't end up getting into the black by accident, and I can really control how much the colors blend. You will have to dip a small brush like that more frequently. Round brushes hold a lot more water, and that's why I don't want to use a round brush in this section, because I want to keep some of those colors, some of those little flecks, a little bit more more pronounced. Had a little, probably a little too much water there. Okay, now while this is still wet, I can intensify the color a little bit with this green. Now I want to make sure that when I color, I'm getting the shape of the iris. The iris will have these like kind of flecks that come out from the center. And this is really going to fill the tooth. So that's another thing about a smooth paper versus a rougher paper, is that if you're using your pencils dry, it's not going to take as much pencil. So you do have to be aware when you're adding your pencil in that if you're going to need to add more layers, that you have room to add more layers, or you got to plan on liquefying your layers. So you lock those in, let it dry, and then you can do more on top. So those are things that you're going to learn the more that you use your pencils, but I thought it's worth mentioning that way. you kind of know what to expect. And if you're too rough on your paper, working dry on wet, because the dry pencil is kind of stiff, you can end up with, you know, pilling paper or scraping everything off your paper. So just kind of keep that in mind. I did just decide to go and grab this green just because I thought it looked a little bit more like the color in the eyes, and I think I'm probably going to have to let this dry before I can do another layer on it, but I'm really happy with the way it's looking so far. I also spied another brown that I didn't realize I had, and I think would actually work really well for some of these techniques. So I'm going to go ahead and do some texturing with this pencil. So on the nose, I'm going to do a technique called scumbling, which is when you do kind of like scribbly lines and it gives you a nice texture. And so I'm doing that for the kind of the little line down the middle of the nose, and just for a little bit of shading and texture on the bottom of the pink. I'm also going to use this, because it's pretty sharp already, I'm going to use this to do some little furs on the nose. My paper is still a little damp, so I know whatever I put on here, that texture should remain. I also feel like this would look nice over here, because I really want to start getting to the finishing stages of this where I have, you know, drawn on fur and all of that. I think this is a nice warm brown, and I think that it will go with all the other colors that I put pretty well, especially if I go and I add it throughout the picture. So I want to go and throw some fairly distinct lines in here. Now, I don't know if you can really notice it on camera, but what I'm doing is I'm actually turning the pencil as I go and working on the edge. And the reason I do that is because I like to conserve lead, and I don't want to have to sharpen my pencil all the time. So if I can keep kind of turning it as I go, then I won't have to sharpen it so often, and I won't waste so much lead, and I won't waste any time sharpening. I typically use an electric sharpener, but my electric sharpener is upstairs and I am downstairs, so I'm stuck with a handheld one. And I do find that I tend to break the leads more when I'm using a handheld sharpener. So I'm going to go over here and do the same thing on this side of the face. Less is more, I think, when it comes to texturing, because if you put too many details in, then it can look really, it can make everything kind of out of balance, or you can have too many focal areas, and I really want the focal areas to be around the face. So I pretty much want most of my texture to be right around the eyes and the muzzle. I wanted to brighten up the eyes, so I'm using a technique called burnishing, where you color very firmly over an area with a lighter shade. I'm using yellow because I know it's really going to bring out those greens, but then I can go in with some of the greens as well and bring out the color that way. Burnishing flattens down the tooth of the paper. Hot press paper doesn't have a lot of tooth to begin with, but this will even make it more glassy and make it much more smoother and brighter. With watercolor pencils, you won't have to worry so much about getting a waxy buildup like you would if you were burnishing with regular wax base color pencils, which is a little more customary. So that's a really nice advantage. I honestly never thought about burnishing with watercolor pencils until I did this project today. And I'm finding it's really a beautiful technique, and it works really well, at least on this hot press paper. By burnishing, though, the one downside is that you are limiting how much color is going to stick, okay? So if I go over, I start burnishing an area, I'm not going to be able to put much on top of that. It's going to really fill that tooth up so that it won't take anymore. I know I need to get that black iris in there, so I'm going to go ahead and do that right now because I feel like I've got pretty much all the colors I need. And I just want to make sure I get it in there accurately, so I'm going to make sure I take my time. You can also burnish with white. I'm going to go over the highlight in the eye with white and also feather it out a little bit, because often when you have like a white highlight, it's not super sharp and it kind of fades out. Usually cats aren't going to be looking right at the light, so you're just going to get like a little glimmer. And I'm going to do a little bit of white at the bottom just to give it a little bit of a little more glow. Sometimes when you're coloring this firmly, you will end up with some crumbling on your pencils. That's completely normal. And I'm going to use the white watercolor pencil here to brighten up some areas around the focal point on the face. A white watercolor pencil is not as bright as a traditional colored pencil. So if you are doing this and you're feeling like you wish you had a brighter pencil and you have colored pencils, go ahead and use your colored pencil. You can use colored pencil over watercolor pencil if you're sure you're kind of in your last layers, because watercolor pencil is not going to stick on top of regular colored pencil. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're doing that, and just kind of keep your layering mediums in mind, thinking fat over lean. Like, I can't put something waxy over something watery. And I mean, I can't put something watery over something waxy and expecting it to stick. But as long as you keep that in mind, you're going to be fine. I like that the white pencil will give me a really soft highlight without affecting things too much. So I can keep burnishing over with this white and adding kind of soft highlights throughout the painting. As I get away from the face, I'm going to just pretty much do this in my lighter areas anyway, because I do feel like I kept my values pretty accurate. I'm going to be less worried about detail and less fussy as I get away from the face, because I want the focal point to be the face. If you find anything is just too bold or just standing out too much, what you can do is you can soften it, because we've just been using watercolor pencils here. So if I decide that's too bold or this is too bold, all I have to do is go in with a damp brush and just kind of pat it out a little bit. You don't want to get rid of all your detail though, so just kind of any place it just feels like you got a little bit too much going on, you can just soften those shapes. Try to wisp it out though. If you're going to an edge of something that you've just kind of softened, just make sure you're wisping it out so you don't have any jarring starts and stops. And you can also lift. Anywhere you got too much dark, you can lift it up. Watercolor pencil is really, really good for that. And this is the point for just small little details. Want a little bit of shadow under the muzzle. Do it with a small brush. You can fan it out with your rake. We're just in small detail land now. Now there's a couple different ways you can do highlights on a finished piece, and it really just depends on how pure you want your painting to be. If you want it to be absolutely watercolor or watercolor pencil, you can take an X-Acto knife and you can scratch off details. So basically what you'd be doing is scratching off to the white of the paper. This is not my favorite technique, but if I had to, for whatever reason, I didn't have any other option, I could do that. So let me just zoom into the kind of eyebrow area and show you how I would do that. You need to be in an area that's got quite a bit of color on it so you can see the contrast. And then you're just going to, I like to use the tip of my blade, but instead of like going like I'm going to cut the paper, I'm kind of scraping crossways, if that makes sense. So I'm just like shaving off that top layer of paint basically. I don't like this method as much because it can impart more texture than you want in a piece. But on the other hand, it's handy because like on the, say like on the chin, I want just a little bit of fuzz. I don't want a lot, so I feel like that could give me a more subtle look than if I went in with like a white paint pen. So I'm going to do that on the muzzle, eyebrows, and chin, just for a very, very soft look. Of course, you want to be aware that you don't slice through your paper. And if you're playing along at home, which I assume you are, turn your paper so that you're comfortable. You don't want to injure yourself. You don't want to cut yourself. So, you know, this is definitely not a technique for young children or anybody that's terribly clumsy. Okay, so that is one way to do this. I actually might do it up here too, because that might be nice just right up around the eye. A little bit of highlight. And you are making texture on the paper, so just kind of keep that in mind. The other thing that I like to use is a white paint pen. My favorite is the Posca paint pen. The Uniball Signo white gel pen is also really nice. I like the Posca because I know it's archival, and it doesn't clog, and I've been able to refill it, which I really like. You want to shake it up well, mix up the paint. You don't have to shake up a paint pen, a gel pen. You do have to shake up a paint pen. And then I will test it on my test paper to make sure it's flowing. Now the brightest detail that I'm going to want to put in there will be the whiskers. So what I will do is make sure my paper's dry. I'll rest my hand on my paper so that I have a nice stable area to work from, and I will pull whiskers from the muzzle. So whiskers are coming out of that area that you've stippled on the black. Sometimes you need to scribble out your paint pen a couple times. But I find that usually gives me really good results. Now you can also do this with a black paint pen because the whiskers will sometimes be black or brown. I'm just going to test this on my test paper before I do it because I have a feeling this might be too dark. However, if it does end up being a little dark, I can always go around the eye with this as well and bring in that dark focal point elsewhere. So I'm going to go ahead and do this knowing that I may full well have to add this to other places to make it fit. Oh, I really like that. And I'm going to do a couple over here too. Now sometimes when you are going over a dark area, like on the around the eyes, if you're going on top of thick colored pencil or thick watercolor pencil, there is still a bit of wax in there, and that can kind of make your paint pen skip. You might need to scribble it off onto onto your test paper just to make sure it's, you know, flowing really well. So just kind of keep that in mind. But I think this is a nice way to add just a little bit of depth into the focal point. I think maybe it might have been a mistake to add it to the eyes. I don't know. I think it looks pretty good. I think it really brings the focus into the eyes, but I think I'll wait before I add any more. But I do want to do more with the white pen. Just make sure that you're not, it dries pretty quick. Just make sure you're not going to be resting your hand in it when you go to do like the ears. Any place you've got those wispy white hairs, you can go ahead and you can use your paint pen for that. These are those sharp details that are going to put everything else into focus and make your picture look finished. I'm a big fan of using mixed media techniques. I feel like you can have the best of both worlds when you do that. A little bit around the eyes here. Oh, I think that white around the eyes really makes a big difference in brightening everything up. And plus you can get those really sharp details that maybe you couldn't before with either the pencils or by scraping. I like going over the sparkles in the eyes with the white paint pen and just adding little catches of light. I think it really brings the attention in. Other places I want to brighten up, what I will do if I don't want them quite so bright is I will sketch in with the paint pen, and then I will kind of dab it with my finger. Now the other advantage to this is sometimes if you have clogged the tooth and you've added a lot and you just can't seem to get anything to stick, you can go ahead and put like a acrylic paint pen down or something, and then you can go over with another product like your watercolor pencils, and you can go and put more in, because it locks down the layers underneath and allows you to go on top with some other colors. So, you know, if you do find that you've kind of filled up the tooth and you can't get the stuff to stick that you want to, you can go ahead and lock it down with an acrylic medium and then go on top. Now just keep in mind that paint you put, the watercolor pencil you put on top will become a little bit more water reactive. So you want to make sure that, you know, you don't reactivate it by accident. And that pretty much does it. I feel like I need a little bit more shadow, like under the eyelid. So this is all, you know, pretty basic, just little adjustment things. Since this is burnished, I can just go in with this black pencil, black watercolor pencil, and just kind of color over it, and it will just drop down enough pencil that that it will shade it. Generally I wouldn't use black for this, but because it's burnished, I know it's not going to take more than I need. Give myself a little shadow there, and I think I'm going to call this done, really. I feel like my shadows are pretty good. You can always take a break. That's another tip I would have, would be take a break when you're working, and, you know, go for a walk, go have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, go have lunch, whatever it is you need to do, and come back and look at it and say, okay, how does it look now? You'll generally find that things will stand out to you that you didn't notice before, and you'll end up with a stronger composition. Now the last thing I like to do is remove the tape and have that beautiful white border, and a tip for doing that, well, I have a couple tips. So first you could try removing it as is. Sometimes your tape will come off really easily, but when I remove it, I peel it back on itself. So see how it's like kind of down at a 45-degree angle and peeled right back on itself? And that usually keeps me from tearing my paper. If I still find that my paper wants to tear on me, what I will do is I will heat this with a heat tool or a hair dryer. The heat will loosen up the adhesive and make it easier to remove. Because I use cheap masking tape instead of buying painter's tape or frog tape or whatever those those more expensive low-tack tapes are, sometimes they'll want to stick on me. This one is not giving me any trouble, but if you ever have something too sticky, whether it be a price tag on something you bought or masking tape that doesn't want to let go of your paper, try using a hairdryer or heat tool, and that will solve your problem. And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, these hacks for watercolor pencils, and give it a try. What's your favorite hack? If you have a favorite watercolor pencil hack, please let me know in the comments below. We can all learn from each other, and I'm sure you know a thing or two that I don't. I want to thank our sponsor, AmazeRock, for sponsoring this video today and for sponsoring a contest. They're going to give away 3 sets of watercolor pencils. So 3 lucky viewers, you guys, will win a set of watercolor pencils. If you want to enter into the prize drawing, click on the link in the video description. It will take you to the prize page, and good luck. I'll also have a link on where you can buy these pencils if you want to get them for yourself, your friend, your kid. It's a wonderful present, and it would make a really good stocking stuffer too if you're trying to get ahead on holiday shopping. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate a thumbs up before you go, and share it with your crafty friends. If you're not already a subscriber, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you'll know the next time I post a video tutorial. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, happy crafting.